What's up? We are going to talk about understanding more about religious institutional trauma, the research, and the educational insights. So, before we dive into this topic, I need to share some important disclaimer information. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. I'm sharing research and information about religious institutional trauma patterns, not providing medical or psychological treatment. So if you're experiencing trauma symptoms, anxiety, depression, or other kind of mental health concerns, please consult with a qualified health professional. Individual experiences are going to vary greatly, and this information should absolutely not replace professional medical or psychological care. So now let's explore this stuff together. I thought about how I would start this conversation and in that reflection, I reflected on a conversation maybe about a week or so ago. I was talking with a friend who had been struggling with some anxiety and depression for several years. And she mentioned something that just kind of stuck to me. She said, I've been in therapy for 3 years and I've never told anyone that every time I try to pray or meditate, I get these panic attacks, or I do something to distract myself, like clean the house or talk to a friend. Sometimes something that just keeps me distracted altogether. I thought there was something wrong with me spiritually. Wow. This conversation reminded me why we need to understand religious institutional trauma, because what my friend was experiencing isn't uncommon. According to research from the Global Center for Religious Research, approximately 1/3 of US adults, that's about 89 to about 109 million Americans, report that they've experienced religious trauma at some point in their lives. That's a pretty significant number that needs and deserves our attention and understanding. So today we're going to explore religious institutional trauma, what Dr. Marlene Winell terms religious trauma syndrome. And I'm going to share some educational information about approaches that some people might find helpful when working with qualified professionals. We're going to also look at the research, examine what various wisdom traditions teach us about spiritual well-being, and I'm going to share an educational case study that kind of illustrates these patterns. Let me be clear about something that's very important. This conversation is absolutely not about criticizing religion, faith, or spirituality. It's about understanding how institutional patterns can sometimes cause harm and recognizing that when religious institutions hurt people, they may not be representing the love and the compassion that most spiritual traditions actually teach. And as Jesus himself said in Matthew 23, he criticized religious leaders who bind heavy burdens and grievous to be home and lay them on men's shoulders. What this means is that Jesus was addressing religious leaders who created impossible spiritual rules and expectations that crushed people's spirits, while these same leaders didn't follow their own teachings. Even within religious texts, we can recognize that spiritual authority can sometimes be misused. Let me share what research has discovered about religious institutional trauma, because understanding the research helps us to recognize that this is a documented phenomenon with measurable impacts. Let's continue with what Dr. Marlene Winell, who really developed the concept of religious trauma syndrome, describes it as the condition experienced by people who are struggling with leaving authoritarian, dogmatic religions and coping with damage of indoctrination. Wow. Research suggests that what makes religious trauma particularly challenging is that it can contribute to chronic stress from harmful religious practices, with the additional stress of potentially losing one's entire meaning system and community. That could be a lot. Studies indicate that symptoms can be extensive and and it may affect multiple aspects of a person's life. Cognitively, researchers have observed patterns including confusion, difficulty with critical thinking, that black and white thinking patterns, perfectionism, and challenges with decision making. Emotionally, people may experience depression, anxiety, anger, grief, loneliness, difficulty experiencing pleasure, even a sense of loss of meaning. Socially, individuals might lose their entire social network, experience family difficulties, even separations and abandonment, social challenges, and find themselves navigating developmental tasks that maybe they've missed. Research published in the International Journal of Nursing Practice found that religious trauma demonstrates a relationship with depressive symptoms. So this is important. A study in Austria examining Catholic churches abuse survivors found that 48.6% met the criteria for PTSD and 84.9% showed clinically significant symptoms. This research suggests that these experiences really have measurable impacts on mental health and well-being. What researchers have noted is that religious trauma can sometimes really be challenging to identify in traditional therapeutic settings. Religious trauma syndrome may present similar to post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, even anxiety disorders and other conditions. Some individuals report spending time in therapy without their religious experiences being recognized as potentially relevant to their symptoms. So, to understand how religious institutions might contribute to trauma, research has identified specific patterns that can occur within these systems. It's important to note that these patterns don't occur in all religious institutions, but understanding them can really help us recognize potentially harmful dynamics. So let's look at the first pattern researchers identified is authoritarian control, where religious leaders may claim absolute authority and expect unquestioning obedience. This can create environments where questioning, doubt, or independent thinking might be discouraged or labeled as problematic. Some people report experiences asking questions about doctrine actually was discouraged or even seen as spiritually dangerous. Now, the second pattern involves spiritual manipulation, where religious concepts, scriptures, or practices might be used to control behavior. This might include claiming to speak directly to God, using religious texts out of context, or creating systems of spiritual rules that keep people in this place of fear. It's worth noting that these practices often contradict the original intent of the spiritual text and tradition they claim to represent. Now, financial control represents another pattern where excessive financial demands or financial oversight might be used to maintain influences over the community members. Some individuals report being told that financial struggles indicate spiritual problems or being pressured to give beyond their means as a demonstration of faith. Sexual abuse by religious authorities represents probably one of the most serious forms of institutional harm. Research indicates that when this occurs, the psychological impact can be particularly severe because it involves a violation of sacred trust. When someone in a position of spiritual authority commits abuse, it can affect not just the physical well-being, but also the person's ability to really trust spiritual guidance. Then there's emotional manipulation through guilt, shame, And fear-based approaches really can create environments where people's natural emotions and responses are just seen as problematic. So joy, anger, sexuality, curiosity, and independence might be labeled as, ooh, seriously, spiritually dangerous, which can teach people to distrust their own emotional responses. Then there's social isolation patterns. That might involve discouraging or restricting relationships outside the religious groups. This includes pressures to limit contact with family members who don't share your faith or the faith. Avoiding friendships with those non-believers, or creating such demanding schedules that there's really little time for outside the relationships. Information control really involves restricting access to outside perspectives, education, media, or even certain books. This can create what researchers call information gaps, where people leaving these environments might find themselves unfamiliar with aspects of broader culture, science, or critical thinking approaches. For example, some individuals report never learning about evolution, having limited exposure to literature outside of religious texts, or being unfamiliar with other religious or philosophical perspectives. You know, what's interesting is that many ancient wisdom traditions, including religious texts, are sometimes misused to create harm. Actually, certain insights about spiritual well-being and freedom may be from the oppressive religious practices. In Christianity, Jesus himself was often critical of religious authorities who used their power harmfully. In Matthew 23, he addressed religious leaders who bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne and lay them on the man's shoulder, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. He also criticized those who shut up the kingdom of heaven against men and who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayer. For example, Jesus was addressing religious leaders who created these impossible rules for regular people while living luxury lives themselves, who prevented people from experiencing spiritual connection directly, and who took advantage of vulnerable people while appearing holy. The biblical concept of freedom appears in passages like Galatians 5:1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened against by a yoke of slavery. This passage suggests that spiritual freedom, rather than religious control, was intended to be the central aspect of Christian experience. In Judaism, Hebrew scriptures include passages like Isaiah 6:1. Actually, it's 61:1, which describes a divine mission to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom from the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. You know, this passage emphasizes liberation and restoration rather than control. And then Catholic mystic traditions, despite institutional challenges, does offer wisdom about direct personal spiritual connection. Saints like Teresa of Avila wrote about the internal castle, or the soul, where individuals can encounter the divine directly, really suggesting that spiritual connection doesn't require institutional mediation. Then the Mormon teachings include concepts and personal revelations of individual spiritual confirmation, suggesting that each person kind of can receive direct spiritual guidance rather than depending entirely on the institutional authorities. Buddhist teachings emphasize questioning and personal verification of spiritual teachings. The Buddha reportedly said, "Do you believe in anything simply because you are heard? But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit for the all, then accept it and live up to it. This kind of suggests that spiritual seekers should think critically and really test teachings against their own experiences. Then there's the Hindu Vedic wisdom teachings, includes teachings about the divine nature within the person. And in the ancient texts, it suggests, and apologies for my pronunciation, Tat Van Asai, and what that it translates to is thou art that. This really indicates that each person's true nature has these divine qualities rather than being separate from the sacred and requiring institutional mediation. Then there are indigenous wisdom traditions often emphasize personal spiritual authority and that direct connection with the sacred through nature and ceremony, even community support. Many Native American traditions, for example, teach that each person really has their own spiritual gifts and connections that don't really require institutional approval. Then there's the Sufi mystics within the Islam, really emphasizing heart-centered spirituality and the direct experience of divine love. Rumi wrote, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you already love. It will not lead you astray." This suggests trust in inner spiritual guidance rather than external control. The common themes across these traditions include personal spiritual authority, direct spiritual experience, love-based rather than fear-based approaches, community support, and the integration of different aspects of human experience. So let me share an educational case study that illustrates how these patterns might affect someone's life. I'll call this person Maria. This is a composite example created for educational purposes to protect confidentiality while demonstrating these concepts. Maria came from a fundamentalist Christian background where questioning was discouraged. Women were expected to be completely submissive, and expressions of sexuality or independence was labeled as problematic. After leaving this community in her 30s, she found herself really struggling with what she describes as spiritual anxiety, that this was affecting multiple areas of her life. What was particularly challenging for Maria was that she still felt drawn to spirituality, you see, but attempts to pray or meditate or engage in spiritual practices, that would just trigger anxiety responses and this overwhelming fear. Traditional therapy approaches really didn't address the religious component of her experience because they weren't fully addressing these concerns. So working with a therapist trained in religious trauma, Maria can start to see and explore these patterns more authentically, in a freer way. In focusing on spiritual health, she really learned to distinguish between the authentic spiritual experiences and that religious programming. She discovered that her childhood religious community had taught that God was constantly monitoring and judging, and that joy and pleasure, that was suspect, and that natural curiosity was, spiritually dangerous. This had created an internal monitoring system that made relaxation and self-trust very difficult. Through developing self-compassion, Maria began to understand that her anxiety and hypervigilance were normal responses to really an abnormal environment rather than a personal failing. She worked to distinguish between authentic spiritual connection and religious conditioning. The therapeutic work involved processing, let's say, specific experiences of spiritual harm, including being publicly criticized for asking questions, being told that her depression indicated spiritual weakness, and being pressured to share private thoughts with religious leaders who really lacked appropriate training and boundaries. The other aspect of her recovery involved reconnecting with the natural joy and playfulness that had been suppressed, developing a really healthy relationship with food and her body that had been affected by religious shame, learning to see physical well-being as positive rather than problematic, and building healthy relationships after isolation that she had experienced. And so over time, Maria started to report feeling a spiritual life that included things like meditation and prayer and connection to nature, without the fear of shame that she had previously, experienced. She built a supportive relationship with people who respected her spiritual journey without trying to control it, and learned to trust her own inner wisdom and discernment. So it's important to note that Maria's experience represents just one individual's journey, and recovery experiences can greatly vary from person to person. What worked for Maria may not work for others, and professional guidance is essential throughout her process and your process if you choose. Research suggests that addressing religious institutional trauma may benefit from comprehensive approaches that consider multiple aspects of human experience. So things addressing the physical, the emotional, the mental, the social, and the spiritual dimensions. Some therapeutic approaches focus on, let's say, helping people distinguish between authentic spiritual experiences and that religious programming. This might involve learning to recognize the difference between peace that comes from genuine spiritual connection and anxiety that comes from religious performance pressures. So developing self-compassion appears to be important, as religious institutions often involves profound shame and self-criticism. People who have learned to be hypervigilant about their thoughts and their feelings, constantly judging themselves according to these impossible standards. Processing specific trauma experiences through appropriate therapeutic methods can be helpful. So including working with grief and those losing one's entire worldview and community, while also addressing complex trauma responses and developing these new ways of coping strategies. So reconnecting with natural joy and playfulness might be important, as some authoritarian religious environments suppress these natural human experiences. Physical well-being and healthy relationships with food and the body, may also need attention, as these areas are sometimes affected by religious shame and control. So building healthy relationships and community connections is crucial, as people leaving these high-controlled religious groups may have lost their entire social support system and may need to learn new relationship skills. It's important to emphasize that these approaches should be explored with a qualified professional who really understands religious trauma and the individual experiences and needs, because they vary greatly. So, when someone addresses religious institutional trauma with appropriate professional support, the effects may extend beyond the individual. For example, the relationships of family members still in the religious communities might improve. Their work relationships might benefit because there's reduced anxiety and an increased authenticity, and they might become supportive friends and often questioning or guiding other people to question their own religious experiences, providing that safe space. Some people who have addressed their own religious trauma report becoming advocates for others struggling in similar ways. They've developed compassion for people in controlling religious environments and interest in helping others to really find freedom and support. The process might also lead to different kinds of spirituality than people had before. One that they may be based more on love than fear, freedom rather than control, and personal connection with the sacred rather maybe than dependence on external authorities. For families and communities, when one person addresses religious institutional trauma, it might create space for others to question and explore as well. Children who grew up with parents who address religious trauma might be less likely to experience similar traumas themselves, and they may learn that spirituality can really be a source of comfort and love rather than fear and obligation. If you recognize yourself in the description of religious institutional trauma, it is important to know that support is available. You are not broken. You are not spiritually weak. You are not broken. You are not spiritually weak. I'll say that again. You are not broken. You are not spiritually weak, and you are not alone. What you may have experienced can be a real trauma and deserves appropriate professional attention and support. The first step is often to recognize that what you've experienced might be trauma rather than a normal religious experience. Many people spend time thinking about their struggles with anxiety or depression, relationship difficulties, and spiritual confusion off our personal failings rather than these normal responses to really abnormal environments. Now, the second step, that involves finding support from people who understand religious trauma. This might include therapists trained in religious trauma, support groups for people who have left these high controlled religious groups. There's online communities for people with similar experience, or friends and families members who may offer you some understanding and support. The third step might involve beginning to reclaim your own authority over your spiritual life. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean abandoning spirituality altogether, though for some people that may be part of their journey, and that's okay too. For other people, it might mean learning to distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and religious programming. Developing their own relationship with the sacred based on love rather than fear, and learning to trust their own spiritual discernment. Remember that addressing religious institutional trauma is not a linear process. There might be good days, there might be difficult days, there might be breakthroughs and setbacks, moments of clarity and moments of confusion. This is a normal part of the process. Be patient, be patient, be patient, and compassionate with yourselves as you navigate this journey. If you're interested in exploring whether professional support might be helpful in your situation, I offer a free 15-minute consultation call where we can discuss your specific circumstances and explore where therapeutic approaches might be appropriate for you. As a licensed psychotherapy, hypnotherapy, and wellness coach, I do work with people who are interested in addressing these spiritual traumas while exploring their authentic spiritual life. However, this video does not establish a therapeutic relationship. An individual consultation is necessary for personal guidance. Your well-being matters, not just for you, but for everyone whose life you touch. When you address religious institutional trauma with appropriate support, you might become a source of hope for others who are struggling with similar experiences, and you might show them that freedom is possible, that spirituality can be a source of love and compassion rather than fear and obligation, and that you too can explore, or they too can also explore their authentic spiritual life. So before I close, I want to share some important mental health resources. If you're experiencing thoughts of self-harm, please contact the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 988 or text HOME, that's HOME, to 741-741 for the crisis text hotline. For general mental health support, the Mental Health National Hotline is 1-800-662-4357, and they're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Remember, this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical, psychological, or therapeutic advice. Individual experiences are going to vary greatly, and professional psychological it is recommended for anyone who experiences trauma, symptoms, or mental health concerns. The approaches discussed should only be explored with a qualified healthcare professional who can provide that personalized guidance based on your specific situation. Thank you for joining me. and this educational exploration of religious institutional traumas. I really love doing these. If this information was helpful, please consider subscribing for more educational content about trauma, spirituality, and mental health awareness. Take care of yourself, and remember that seeking professional support is a sign of strength and courage, not weakness.